Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicole Pulowski. I use she, her pronouns. I work for the Office of International Programs. Welcome to the International Symposium. This session is Shaping Tomorrow, Navigating the Impact of Social Media on Global Democracy, and is presented by Karin Anderson, Professor in Communication Studies at CSU, Samuel Tom, Assistant Professor in Journalism and Media Communication at CSU, and David Wolfgang, Associate Professor in Journalism and Media Communication at Colorado State University. Before we begin, I have a small request. We would be grateful if you could complete a short feedback questionnaire for us before you leave by clicking on the QR code on the poster in front of the room here. Those who are joining us online, you will see a link displayed on your screen at the end of the session, which will take you to the feedback questionnaire. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Karin, Samuel, and David.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for being here everybody. I'm the moderator in this panel, and before we get started with panelist opening statements, I did just want to mention that we are having a democracy summit next week at CSU. So there are some really fantastic events. All of them are free, including a keynote speech by Debbie Kamau Bell for our opening keynote and a closing keynote with Robert Putnam. So we'd love to head on over to the Thematic Year of Democracy webpage on the CSU website to see the full schedule. And we would love to see you at that series of events as well. I want to provide just a little bit more information about my fellow panelists. So David Wolfgang, right next to me, is Associate Professor in Journalism and Media Communication at Colorado State University. His research focuses on public discourse, political journalism, and media sociology. In particular, he studies how journalists promote the democratic norms of pluralism and public participation. Wolfgang is a former journalist and holds a law degree and PhD from the University of Missouri. And then at the end, we've got Dr. Samuel Tom. Samuel Tom is Assistant Professor of Strategic Communication and Advertising in Journalism and Media Communication at Colorado State University. As a media psychologist, Tom's research interests lie in the domain of digital advertising, ad avoidance, and problematic media use, especially in video gaming. He's interested in understanding the processes of media engagement and developing ethical advertising messaging for vulnerable populations that are susceptible to problematic media use. His published research looks at the intersection of digital advertising, problematic media use, and mental and social health. My role here is primarily as moderator, but I'm a professor in communication studies and I study political communication. So I may chip in here and there on topics of authoritarianism.
That's an authoritarian.
Authoritarian expert. That's why I'm the moderator. All right, let's start with your opening comments, please. And David will start.
Sure. So for my interests, research-wise, I come from a very practical journalism background. So my concerns are kind of built around how some of the issues around journalism and social media can cause some worries, concerns, and a current predicament for that industry. Journalism really is in a precarious position when it comes to its relationship to social media right now. We can look back 20 years and be concerned about the relationship of journalism to its funding models, advertising business, and see it was in trouble. But the concern about social media has gotten much worse now. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen a significant drop in the amount of traffic referrals that come from social media back to news websites. One of our easiest way of recognizing how the black box of the algorithmic processes that happen on Facebook and X and Instagram work is to recognize where traffic starts and stops or doesn't come anymore. And we've seen that happen quite fast over the last 2 years. News websites have already given up on the idea that people are going to organically just go straight to their website anymore. That's just not how people use news content online. They became overly reliant on social media, and then Facebook and others have started to pull the plug on them, essentially. There are a lot of potential causes, although we don't completely understand the problem fully. For instance, Facebook notably loves to talk about how audiences want a more rich, engaging experience with people they actually know. So we're going to deprioritize institutional and organizational content in favor of content from the people you actually know in real life. But over that same time period, we've seen as Facebook has doubled down on sponsored content and advertising and kind of like created a Hippocratic kind of context there where, yes, you want rich, engaging content with people you know, and you also want the sponsored content that we're going to hand you as well. We've also seen increasing political pressure, which we'll probably get into at multiple cases today in this discussion. But there is pressure now on social media and networks to be a little bit more information agnostic, essentially treating content somewhat similar to a common carrier, as we would refer to it. Kind of like the postal service treating all mail the same, or phone services treating all phone calls the same. There is political pressure for them to be a little more cautious about, allowing content from conspiracy theorists to be treated with a similar context as people who are trying to promote more legitimate forms of content. And so as they face more political pressure like that, they're kind of cautious about maybe moving away from being the deciders of what is good and what is bad, and more of just the conduit of information, which could potentially lead to a lot of problems. The other aspect that I want to think about from a global context in terms of journalism's relationship to social media is what's happening in other parts of the world that hasn't happened here in the US yet. We've seen this increasing regulatory pressure from, especially in Canada and in Australia, to force platforms to pay news organizations for the engagement that they provide. News organizations provide them with clicks and engagements, time spent on site, but there's no financial revenue that comes from that for the news organization, essentially. Canada and Australia have tried to force that. Facebook essentially said, okay, we'll leave the news market in Canada, trying to call their bluff, and they did. Google last year spent $74 million paying back Canadian news organizations as part of the law, but Facebook just essentially said, we're not going to participate. And in Australia, they've pulled back as well, questioning whether or not that law has any real enforcement teeth to kind of force that kind of relationship. What's most concerning for me about those attempts is that what we've seen is Facebook seems to think that their influence and their power is strong enough that they can just avoid the problem altogether. And who's been most harmed by their response to those laws has been small and regional and provincial in Canada news organizations. The CBC, one of the larger news organizations in Canada, reports that they've seen very little difference in how it's affected their revenue by losing Facebook redirects. But smaller organizations are like, oh, it's hurt us a lot. So seeing that potential response and how that doesn't quite fill the gap for trying to fix the problem of forcing media organizations or forcing social media to pay them back means that we're going to maybe have to go back to the drawing board in terms of regulation and policy that might help kind of solve some of these problems. And I've already my 5 minutes turned into a tangent, but and that'll probably happen a lot today. But from the context of how journalism relates to it, we're in a very, very still a Wild West situation in terms of funding models and trying to force the hand of platforms to hand over more of their revenue that is driven by news engagement in the first place. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the introduction. So I figured that since the topic today is that we're really looking at two things, right? The impact of social media on one hand, and the other is global democracy. As you can tell, I'm not American from my accent, the way I look. I'm from Singapore, which is in Asia, and I'm hoping to provide a slightly different perspective in terms of what global democracy means, right? So I think let's break down some terms. And one of the things we like to do is to kind of define what words mean, right? So I think democracy, we hear that term a lot. I think it comes from the Greek word demos kratos, right? I hope I'm saying it right, which means people power, right? I think it's a power of the people, the will of the people. You've heard that said in different terms. In America, right? I think that the idea of democracy is often associated with the concept of freedom. But what is freedom? I think freedom, depending on where you are in the world, might look a little bit different, right? So let us think of the example of a human being, right? If you say that if I have freedom, I do not have boundaries, I could do whatever I want, I have no restrictions, is that what truly freedom means? If that is the case, of that freedom is that it means that no restrictions, no boundaries, oceans. Why aren't human beings living in the ocean? Right? It's like, what's gonna happen? We're gonna drown. So some boundaries are maybe good, right? Likewise for a fish, you know, if they're out of the ocean, they're out on land, probably gonna die. So the idea of freedom, I think we need to establish comes with some boundaries, some restrictions. What does that look like? And as we think about global democracy, right, that freedom is going to look differently in each culture that we're examining. Such that, you know, what freedom looks like in America may not be what freedom looks like in Singapore, in India, in Ethiopia, Argentina, right? So that's kind of a concept that we should kind of think about as we kind of talk about the idea of what global democracy might look like and how that's different in authoritarian regimes and in different places. The second part, of course, of what we're talking about is the impact of social media. David here, he's a journalist. He's done a lot of work with journalism, right? I'm on the other hand, I have done work in advertising. So if you might remember this really famous meme where Mark Zuckerberg, you know, many years ago was asked the question by a senator, like, how does Facebook make money? And he says, you know, Senator, we run ads. So the idea, the impact of how ads contribute to the landscape of social media, right? I think one of the things that we see in the world with news, right? Kind of moving from established news agencies to social media. People go to social media to find the news is because advertisers figured out like we get more eyeballs, we get more potential engagement if we advertise on social media. And social media, that's going to be what we'll talk about today, right, has really shaped the world, the way we kind of understand the world, how we interpret what's happening around us, how we are connected. So I have a bunch of interests, you know, in new technology, in Web 3.0 and AI, and hopefully through this panel, I'll kind of bring that with a cultural lens of from the East as to kind of how we see things.
Thank you. Well, so let's set the table for that conversation, for the conversation about global democracy by spending a little bit of time talking about authoritarianism specifically. That's kind of the elephant in the room in the United States. It's the elephant in the room in more ways than one. But in terms of authoritarianism, I think I'm old enough to remember when there wasn't an internet. And in the early days of the internet, we certainly were excited about the democratizing potential of the internet. And then when social media came on the stage, that too, we thought, and actually there were observable democratizing events happening with some of the revolutions that were made possible by Twitter and other platforms. But more recently, social media have been used as a force for repression in hybrid and authoritarian regimes. And so the question I want to first pose to our experts is, how have authoritarian regimes used social media, and are we seeing any similar trends in the United States?
Okay, you know, I think that the model of how we think about how social media can be used for political purposes as a form of oppression is not terribly different from how it might be used in other modes as well. Promoting certain, I mean, like we can think of it in the very basic context of like traditional propaganda, but then all the levels of redirecting people's attention, drawing people's attention to other types of problems, creating straw man arguments, developing new kind of fears or problems that didn't exist and trumping them up to become more of a problem or more of a concern in society, trying to drive public attention, suppressing the perspectives of those who would challenge or who would stand up against or provide an alternative view or contrary opinion. There are many ways that it's done in other parts of the world that we haven't quite seen to the extent yet here in the US. We do see the growth of alternative viewpoints and alternative facts, as we ended up calling it about a decade ago during the Trump administration. The growth of misinformation and disinformation as well, that social media can make that kind of information ecology a lot more productive. I think that one of the concerns that I've really been worried about over the last maybe decade plus, is kind of a trend that happened not long after the 2008 election. 2008 election was like still when we were in that perspective of like, oh, the democratizing potential of the internet. Look what Obama did with Facebook to win an election, like as if that wasn't already his election to lose at one point in that stage already. But what we saw come out of that election, I think, is more interesting from the other side, which is the 2008 to 2012 period, where kind of driven by the personality of Sarah Palin, we saw the growth of the Tea Party movement and this rejection of mainstream media almost overtly, whereas John McCain was the last truly like traditional conservative candidate to run for president, maybe from that party, maybe Mitt Romney, I don't know. But like that she specifically kind of moved away from the mainstream media, said, I'm going to either only do interviews with people who agree with what I think and are going to be very fair to me after Katie Couric, the infamous interview that we're all familiar with, I'm sure. Or I'm just going to use social media to completely subvert the media itself. And that has become a very valuable tool for politicians on both sides of the aisle now, where if I don't want to engage, or if it's a topic on which I want to set the tone, I'm just going to use X and Facebook and not even do interviews at all, which at that point was kind of novel and now has become the norm. And the concern is that there's a lot more power to redirect the narrative. I just want to kind of like talk about this quickly, though, in the context of this idea of the democratizing power of the internet, because we love to think about it as like breaking down this idea of the traditional gatekeeper role. And I respect the idea that there are more opportunities for more people to participate. But like, I just like to think that we need to keep in mind that the power hierarchies of the internet are mimicking the power hierarchies of traditional media. And yes, I have more of a voice than I did offline, online, but still very few people are listening to David online. Not that that's probably a good thing. But the reality is that we still have mainstream institutions and political elites and other powerful organizations, corporations, et cetera, that drive the agenda and set the messaging. And it's very infrequent that the average regular citizen is having the same kind of like vocal authority online. So keeping that in mind.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that, just coming from a different perspective, right? I think the question is that what do you consider an authoritarian regime, right? And I think that definition might look a little different depending on which part of the world you come from, right? And so this might not be, what I say, might not be a very popular opinion. I'm not for authoritarian regime, but I think the needle of what that looks like to me might be a little different than what some of us in the room might kind of look at, right? So the idea of what is permissible, right? And we think about what does the government allow, or the government thinks it's good for the people, is something that we could maybe debate all day long and may not get to a conclusion from that. So if we think about what we could do, like say in the country that I was born in, right? In terms of in social media, we have a lot of rules that the government says, it's like you shouldn't be allowed to incite riots, or you do a bunch of things, right? Some of that may seem more draconian compared to what the rules are in America, given that satire is okay. You could go after people, to a certain extent, right? And those are things that you can't do in Singapore, right? And that's kind of how some people would say that that's an oppression of freedom. And I think, in fact, as much as you might have heard about good things about Singapore in the news, several years ago, I think there was a summit on, free speech, or is it or something, and Singapore wasn't invited, right? And that is because in the eyes of some leaders of the world, they do not see Singapore as a free country, and that is their prerogative to say that. I would disagree, and I think that what, like I said at the beginning, right? What freedom is to me might be a little different to what freedom is to you. I think if you look at the more collective, and I don't want to kind of put all of East Asian culture together as one lot together, but I think that if you look at a collectivist culture, right, in the way they see what society means to them, then a lot of that is kind of understanding what a common good is and having the priority of what the commonality denominator looks like, right? So in understanding that when we cede some of that freedom away, and say, you know what, we will let the government decide that this would be good for society, which is be good for the things that we truly value, right? Like giving up some of that freedom by allowing censorship to happen, by not being able to have that voice. And what governments in some of these countries do is that they would tell social media, tell Facebook, tell Twitter, you can have these kind of stuff, right? So for example, I think that you could, in America, you could have some level of pornography on some of these social, like X and stuff, but you cannot do that in those countries because they say that that's not what we value as a society, right? So based on that, I think that it depends on how you read the situation, what lens you're wearing in understanding the types of government, the way they operate. And I think putting the label of is that authoritarianism or is that maybe just a slightly different culture, right? And I think that that's kind of what we could maybe talk through some of those things today and understanding that there are multiple lenses instead of just one or two dominant ones.
I think I'm gonna jump in as a political communication scholar here for a second and talk about something that I've seen with the advent and influx and sort of emphasis on social media and digital communication on political campaigns specifically. I teach political communication, which we spend a lot of time talking about presidential campaigns. And I've noticed that some of my units are becoming less and less relevant because we're not using the kinds of institutions of democratic communication, sort of democratic resources that we're used to. So for example, I used to have a political ad unit. I still kind of do. Political ads used to be the messages that everybody would get about a candidate all at once, and how big of an ad buy can you make? But now, of course, the targeted ads and the ads that nobody in the media will ever see because they're only targeted at individual people and individual prejudices. That's a big change in campaign messaging. The fact that the whole Republican Party said we're not going to participate in the official presidential debates run by the Commission on Presidential Debates. And they don't need to because they got social media as the end run around that institution, that nonpartisan institution. Certainly the Trump's approach to press conferences, which was to kick people out of the room, reporters out of the room who we didn't like, again, because he had that sort of platform available to him from outside, even the White House press corps. So I think that really speaks to what Dr. Tom was talking about in terms of what are the norms of democracy in a culture and how is that related to then democratic health versus the influx of authoritarianism. I'm wondering if the kind of Western Eastern culture clash topic might be illustrated by one of this week's news stories, which is TikTok and what's happening with TikTok. Now, I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that I know about as much about TikTok as my teenagers have showed me. So I don't know much about that platform. But as I was listening to just the coverage of it in the news, I noticed that there is this disconnect when we've got a private, company, and I forgot what TikTok's parent company is called, ByteDance. Thank you very much. We've got a private company that is being influenced by a government that has a very different definition of, what belongs on a social media state, and that the United States government might even regard as an adversary. And then we've got, members of Congress who barely know what the internet is, much like TikTok, kind of trying to decide how to make public policy in this context. So I'm wondering if you all can just tell us what your impression is of what's going on with TikTok, and particularly what's the likelihood of legislation coming out, and what would be the impact?
I think it was Nancy Pelosi that called it Tic Tac.
Yeah.
Yeah, which didn't really help in that sense.
Right.
Tic Tac, Tic Tac, Tic Tac. I think that when we start this conversation, we have to recognize that when it comes to TikTok, even from the levels of the U.S. government in our attempts to legislate it, we're existing in an information vacuum in a sense, because we know it's plausible that the company is being influenced by its government context of ownership, but we don't know that that's happening in the manner in which we think it potentially could be happening. And we don't have the direct evidence of the manipulation that we're all concerned about. So even if it's practically possible, we're not seeing the type of influence that everyone is concerned could be happening with it. So, okay, so we don't have the evidence that it's exactly what we're all fearful of. But we also don't have, on the other hand, any evidence to suggest that it's not happening or that it's not technically possible. So it puts us in this weird kind of vacuum state where we really don't have the information on which we can make an informed decision about whether or not it is a danger, except for the fact that it's plausible, so we should treat it as potentially dangerous. And that's essentially how Congress is going about it. Oh my God, this could be what's happening. Therefore, we can't let foreign adversaries own social media companies that influence American citizens. We need to cut the cord or make them divest and then get it in American hands. And some element of that is just concerning from the free speech perspective, not only because there's so many people who won't be able to express themselves the same way without that tool there, but also because we're making decisions about this app and others based on a hypothetical circumstance we don't know is occurring. I heard another individual refer to it recently as akin to security theater, the same idea of like the TSA. You know, they make us go through all these hoops to give us the semblance of an idea that we're safe and secure and everything's gonna be fine, but they're terrible at their jobs. And we consistently know from auditing that they're not actually doing it that well. And it's the similar context of like, do we take the drastic action in order to protect people while we recognize that this problem broadly is way worse and way more of an issue than this one specific incident? You know, if you're really concerned about your personal data on the internet and you're only worried about the TikTok in China, like you're really missing the majority of the problem, which is that your information's already out there. And if they wanted it, they already had it. And this corporate context of buying and selling and sharing data with foreign adversaries, not just other companies, is already kind of the norm. This is not me saying whether I agree or disagree.
Yeah.
But I think we have to be cautious about potentially what could be the ramifications of it. For instance, the way that that bill is written right now, it could very likely take down a number of other apps that are also Chinese partially owned. Most notably, one of the most common social connection apps for the Chinese diaspora, which is WeChat. If that bill were to pass, it would cause a severe problem for the diasporic community in that context. So,
We'll take some questions at the end.
Okay.
I'll set aside some time for questions.
but I'll turn over to Dr. Tom too.
You said everything. I'm just kidding.
We're both avoiding giving straightforward answers on this.
No, I think that fundamentally, I think that there, you know, as we kind of, we have seen in the last 10, 20 years or so, there's a rise in media literacy education, right? How do we detect if a piece of information is accurate? What is an ad? What is not an ad? What's an article, right? How do you know what a source is, right? And I think that we've kind of come to a similar crossroads with technology. How many of you understand the technology of tracking on the phone? I think that not a lot of us do, right? Like what exactly is geofencing, for example? How do people serve ads to you based on the location? How do those ads follow you around through retargeting or prospecting, right? These are these different manners in which technology works, how our phones is tracking us, and we put it in our pockets just like Tic Tacs, right? But I think that that's fundamentally a technology question and understanding, right? Like what is being tracked? What is the data? Because when we think about the tech giants that's out there, right? The Googles, the Metas, right? Apple, all they're interested in kind of having, or at least what's making them very powerful, is the fact that they have information, right? It's not only just your name or your date of birth, but where you live, with what keywords you like to shop, right? And we don't know exactly how much of those data they have been able to piece together, right? I think that's a big problem, because if you only have my location of where I park to school or where I live, that may be fine. But if you have where I live, plus where I drive to every day, plus, my favorite cereal, plus, my favorite brands of clothes or board games and things I like to do, then it might start to become a more serious issue, right? So when we think about what with the TikTok ban, I think the question really is, how much information do they have? What level of data? And I think that if they could say, we have all these random pieces of data that don't connect, then I think it'll be I think that being educated, knowing what levels of information, what we're looking at, will give us, just a better understanding as to what this ban is about.
I would note also that I think not long ago, recently, I think Google changed its policies, so political ads can only be targeted based on age, gender, and like your zip code, not any closer than that. So like responding to this potential problem of people targeting based on race or socioeconomic status and really trying to divide and conquer in a sense.
Right.
But still, like zip code can get you really close to
Just
people.
say, like, we already know with redistricting that,
Yeah.
that if people wanna make it look partisan, but really it's motivated by race.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you've heard about was it today where Google basically admitted fault to the whole, well, they didn't admit fault, but the whole incognito when you're on Chrome, right?
Mhm.
And that's really like the amount of data they have. So we'll get rid of it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oops.
Yeah.
It wasn't an oops, it was just like, well,
We've been doing this all along, but we're not gonna pay out anything
Yeah.
as part of it.
Saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
Well, Samuel, I want to address this follow-up question then to you, and that's specific to some of the technological changes and challenges, all right? How do you feel that the evolving technologies in the social media landscape will affect data and democracy? And thinking specifically of things like Web 3.0, AI, the functionality of algorithms. Can you talk a little bit more about some of those technical advantages and their connections to democracy?
I could try. I'm no expert, right? So it could be someone in this room that knows more than I do. So I like to kind of preface by saying that. So a little bit of history lesson, I think that you might have heard the word Web 3.0, right? But I think what is the difference in Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3, right? So Web 1 is kind of back in the early days, was it the late 80s, early 90s of the you have your Netscape browser, Alta Vista search, and all that kind of stuff. And that's kind of where you would go to a website, you would just look at it, and that's all you could do. Just check out a website. Maybe you could click a link to email, but they just all pages, right? That it's kind of hyperlinked and all that stuff, and they kind of create this web of what that looks like, right? So Web 2 came in, where it allows users to be able to interact with websites, right? So you think about where you're able to, and social media is an essential part of Web 2.0, where you can have feedback, right? So this is kind of where someone says something, you can make a comment, you can leave a like, right? And if you talk to a store, they could, have a chat bot reach out to you and talk to you and give you like, these are opening hours, this is how much an item is, right? So there is all that interaction, right? So as you could see in the world of Web 2.0, and I've alluded to this a little earlier, is that these tech companies have become very rich. They have become very powerful because suddenly they become the middleman, right? They kind of consolidate. They have all these data about us that's out there that's kind of on some centralized server computers that they own somewhere out there, probably in, I don't know, California or wherever. And that's kind of where our data resides. So as we kind of think about Web 3.0, and I think some of you might have heard of blockchain technology,
Yeah.
and cryptocurrency is often based on that, right? One of the key things about Web 3 is the decentralization of data. Instead of it being stored on one computer, it could be stored on a peer-to-peer network, like maybe 15 different computers or 5 computers around the world at different places, right? What makes blockchain efficient, and someone could do probably a better job than I do, is that when the data gets written to a block and it's stored on those computers, right? So when new data comes in that gets written, it kind of adds to that chain, right? So it's called blockchain. So if you want to kind of change data from like say 10 months ago or something, it could be a ledger record, it could be a number, or it could be a bunch of whatever information, right? There has to be an agreement between all these computers that you allow that to happen. Right? So I think as we move to a more decentralized system, right? So security wise, I think it's a lot harder to hack on a blockchain versus a single computer. So if you think about security wise, blockchain is definitely seemingly more secure at this time based on the way that we are talking about it. I'm sure hackers at some point will figure out how to hack. I mean, hackers are notorious for being innovative in their own way. But what changes the equation with social media as we kind of move into the blockchain world, the Web3 world, is the idea of data ownership. Who owns that data, right? So if you suddenly become the person that says, I will allow you to know where I've been going, right? In exchange for whatever, like watching free, movies or programming, right? That is gonna be something that as a consumer, someone that owns your own data, you will be able to kind of make the case and say, I don't wanna give you my data, right? Right now, you're actually, you're basically your permissions, right? I mean, there are many rules that's out there today with, like GDPR, CCPA, these are regulations in Europe, in California, and then Colorado has one as well.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, as to how companies, right, could use your data. But in a Web3 world, what really happens is that I think in an ideal Web3 world, you would have access and control of your data as to what you're willing to kind of provide to organizations, and maybe even talk about provide information as to what kind of ads that you might see, right? Because we live in this Web 2 world where we get hyper personalized ads. They have all this information about you, and they send an ad to you based on what they think you like, right? So that's going to change in the Web 3 world potentially if things go as planned, and we know that doesn't always go that way.
And thankfully, in Colorado now, you have a right to tell a corporation that they cannot show you targeted advertising on their site. So there's at least one way that we can get out of it here. Although I tried it last summer as a test for my students in the fall, and it is terribly difficult depending on the site you're trying to get to do that. But, kind of a fun process, I guess.
Well, maybe that leads to our next question with respect to law and policy. Can you talk a little bit about the legal landscape, both in the United States, but then also the landscape as we are working across borders, across political systems?
Sure. I think that when we think about an international context, the first place we typically go in this space is with the GDPR, which is the EU's regulation of data privacy. It's an extensive protection that is far beyond what any US state has done yet in terms of protecting people, in terms of their access to their data and how it can be used or sold or traded or all kinds of things. It's funny, anytime you go on a website that originates in Europe, the cookie message you get is far more intrusive than the one you get here in the US. I was at ICA, which was in Prague in 2018, during the adoption when it went into place, and the internet was practically unusable that day because everything was just GDPR, consent messaging constantly the entire time. And it was infuriating, but it serves a purpose. I think as of the last time I looked, just this morning, there are 15 states in the US that have passed a data privacy law. We used to live with only California's. California was essentially the data privacy law for Americans because we do not have a federal internet data privacy law. There was an attempt to pass one in the last couple of years. It died in committee, much like it usually does. There hasn't been a lot of bipartisan support in Congress to pass a comprehensive data privacy law. There's a lot more lobbying at that level. But California's was the gold standard for a while, and then within the last 5 years, 14 more states passed their own. Colorado's is seen as a quite extensive one, a really high quality data privacy law. You have the right to access your information, to prevent the sale of your information, to prevent it being used in targeted advertising. You can request the information be deleted. You can even port your information if you want to go to a site and say, give me what you have on me. Don't know that you want to do that. But
it's actually funny.
Yeah, well, I'm scared of it, but
One of the things in GDPR, right, where let's say that you don't like Amazon doing business in GDPR, and you say like, there's something called ship your enemies GDPR. So if you don't like Amazon, you get 50,000 people or say 1,000 people and go to Amazon and say, give me my data right now. Then basically you get paralyzed from doing stuff. So there are like rules around that, but. Yeah.
Well, about mass requests.
Yeah, a mass
for
request.
Privacy tags.
Yeah.
Where do you request? How do you do that? I've never heard of this.
I mean, what you'll see typically is at the bottom of a page, you'll see some kind of privacy context or statement. And then if you go into it, usually they'll bury it in the privacy policy,
Right.
which really should be called an information use policy. It's not about privacy, it's about, this is what we're going to do with your information. Nonsense. But you get in there and there will typically be a little disclaimer section for residents of these states. And then you can click a link and then, you know, with the ones that I was doing last summer, it was typically like you had to fill out some information, provide some basic demographic stat, and I mean, then you could just ship it off and then you'd get confirmation later whether you were approved. Essentially, they were checking to make sure you were actually a resident. You know, the weird thing is, you know, let's say you live in Michigan, which doesn't have a protection law, and you try to use the Colorado law to then obfuscate it, they're essentially going to try and check and make sure that they don't have to do this for you, which is kind of ludicrous in the end. But it would be very nice from a policy perspective if Congress would just pass a comprehensive law, because this is a mess. But
Well, I know that one of the other things that you'd mentioned in some of our preparatory material is that the Supreme Court recently heard a pair of cases from Florida and Texas about regulating social media content. What's the potential impact of those cases depending on how the Supreme Court rules?
sure, they're called the Net Choice cases because Net Choice was a client both trying to sue both Florida and Texas to stop these laws from going into place. Florida's law specifically prohibits banning political candidates from a social media platform. So in that context, maybe Facebook or X would say, you know, Donald Trump, you're no longer welcome. You can't have an account on our site after you tried to, you know, lead an insurrection. In this case, Florida is saying, no, you can't kick them off. You have to allow them to have an account on any social media platform. In Texas's case, platform cannot prohibit, or a platform cannot remove content based on a perspective or viewpoint. So they cannot engage in viewpoint discrimination. So let's say Facebook says, you know what? We don't really like people sharing messages about, you know, drinking chloride or bleach to fix COVID or whatever else, you know, something really dangerous messaging. While in Texas, under this law, they couldn't necessarily prevent that. This goes back to this idea I was talking about earlier about platforms leading toward this information agnostic kind of format, like just common carriers, everything gets through. If these laws are upheld, the concern is that social media platforms will become spaces or bastions for content that a lot of people find really as a turnoff and not really very usable. You'll get a lot more conspiracy content, a lot more hate speech, a lot more dangerous content, which users continually and consistently say, we don't want more of that on this site. When we start applying the First Amendment to private actors, these are companies that there's no inherent reason for them to have to be beholden to the First Amendment. They are private companies, but when they start to have to meet the same requirements, then we're going to have spaces that look a lot like what if the government was running a public platform and a public forum. And if the government, there's reasons why the government doesn't run a social media network. Can you imagine the kind of content that they would just have to sit there and let happen on their site? It would not be a very enjoyable space for many people. So like the concern is that we're kind of pushing toward that kind of context. Social media sites tend to think that we should be treated similar to how any other editorial content production would be, like a newspaper. We get to make choices about what does or doesn't get to be presented in this public space. We are acting somewhat like editors to choose what can and cannot get through. The concern though becomes whether or not the Supreme Court is willing to acknowledge this context of trying to treat a private actor as a state institution kind of sorts. And they seemed pretty resistant in the oral arguments, but you know, that's really hard to read those tea leaves sometimes.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if they came down and said that the laws were upheld in their original form and that social media sites had to allow all that content. It would really create, not only would it create an internet that, or a social media context that is more toxic with content that people want to avoid, but it would essentially, potentially, depending on how they apply these laws, create different social media contexts depending on where you are. So like Facebook, for instance, might say, you know what, okay, Florida, okay, we'll let that happen there. But then in Colorado, they would still prohibit Trump from being able to express his message to his users, which would then create these weird fragmented forms of the internet, which is from a democratic perspective is also pretty concerning.
Right, because for democracies to work, we have to have a shared set of facts.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing erosions in democracy across the world is because we don't have this shared set of facts and social media is exacerbating perhaps the spread of or the people signing on to that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have alternative facts.
I refuse to call those facts. We have facts and we have things that are not facts. Absolutely. Well, so we're gonna open it up here in a few minutes to questions, but before we do that, are there any sort of follow-ups or additional ideas that our speakers wanted to express before we open it up to questions?
No,
Yeah.
I think we're good.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, I would encourage, who's got a question? Yes.
So
right
just
here.
on the perspective of TikTok, no, TikTok. You know, the wrangling that we've had in Congress now when they're wanting to force the parent company to sell off the American version of that. And now Mnuchin is trying to get his investors to purchase this, you know, entity. So it's more, I think, I look at it, and I don't know your perspective, more about who controls the information, what gets out to the people, and how they want to present it, like most of the media sources that have been bought up by corporations starting in the mid-80s till present. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, privately held social media sites are pretty common, and I mean, like, they're all pretty much private corporations at this point. So having a group of investors buy it up I don't think would be terribly different from having Meta or Alphabet or other companies owning these types of platforms. I just worry that when we look at the problem as it's a foreign adversary, we might miss the concern that data is already out there and that marketplace of data and information already exists, and you're not really escaping that part of the problem. Do you trust Steve Mnuchin with your data? Do you trust?
Absolutely not.
Well, adorable, but still, you know, who do we really trust with our data in that sense? And
Yeah.
whether or not they'd be willing to sell it to a foreign adversary too, and it's not necessarily any easier in terms of the resolution to the problem, I guess, but and yeah, to go to the problem of media, you introduced it, the idea of media corporations getting bought up, or media companies getting bought up by corporations today. You know, it's even worse with hedge funds buying up media organizations. We've seen what's happened to the Denver Post and other organizations, to the point where our media environment is so diluted compared to even a decade ago.
Yeah.
And the number of journalists working in the United States is a fraction of what it was. That it's a really concerning downtrend and a scary context. And social media is not filling that gap anytime soon.
Nope.
But if you think about it, there's also the infrastructure technology side as well, right? So yeah, the data exists on some server, but how does that data get moved around, right? So one of the things that you might have heard of is it's undersea cables, right? And whoever owns those lines actually could potentially have a copy of the data, right? Probably it's encrypted, but you know, if you think about it, it's like, you know, the data there are probably more pieces of data around than we actually might usually think about as just only the company has it, right? So there could be other places where the data exists.
Yeah.
Yep.
So a question from one of our online participants. A lot of these laws from Florida and Texas are passing laws that will actively ban LGBTQ plus content as well, by subjectively labeling them as pornographic, just because it mentions specific themes. So how can these laws from Texas and Florida say you can't block a comment based on a specific viewpoint, but also ban content surrounding specific subjects?
Well, they can't really, but you know, I mean, the Supreme Court has been quite clear that pornography is protected under the First Amendment. There can be restrictions on it, and pornographic and sexualized content is not inherently illegal. The rule that we typically use is obscenity, and LGBTQ content is not obscene inherently and on its face. Obscenity, based on the Supreme Court's interpretation, which, I mean, the last case they took up about the issue was in 1972, and it was, you know, I mean, you ask 9 old white dudes in 1972 to define what's obscene,
Yeah.
And you're going down a dangerous road to begin with, but their definition is so far from what most of us would think is the traditional everyday kind of context of what we think of as adult content. So trying to restrict obscene content just based on the fact that it caters to LGBTQ people or features them is not going to get very far. I think in front of state judges who've been installed by Abbott or DeSantis, you might have some success, but the extent to which we get to the federal system and we're applying the Miller test, which is the critical precedent there, there's not really much hope for trying to restrict LGBTQ content exclusively on that kind of front. It is concerning, yes, from the way that they've been specifically ostracized and suppressed. And I would like to see some of these cases move along faster so that we can get clear answers to try and avoid those kinds of problems going forward. But if we're going to apply the Miller test and not come up with something new, it should be a pretty clear case of striking down laws that restrict LGBTQ content as being quote unquote pornographic. Now, they could try to restrict that kind of content for underage populations, and that would be a slight way to subvert the problem. But if you're talking about population in general, you'd have to meet the obscenity test, which it does.
I think that also illustrates why certain political interests are working so hard to say that any conversation about transgender people is sexualized conversation, or to say that what's happening with drag performers, drag artists in libraries is the same as what's happening at a nightclub. You know, they're trying to move us into, for that reason, because it seems removed from this legal context, it seems kind of like a weird premise to begin with. But if you're saying, oh, well, we need to get to obscenity, and to get to obscenity, we need to first sexualize it to push us down that. All right, well then let's start there. So I think that seeing how what's happening in our everyday language with respect to some of these issues is tied to not only what the technology is doing, but what our laws, what's demanded of the law.
Yeah. And even then, it's not just that it's sexual, then it has to have no redeeming social value, no literary, artistic, political, social, scientific purpose. And they really can't do much with that. The Miller test is quite restrictive, which is thankful.
Right. Yeah.
One other question in regards to current ChatGPT and AI. Back in 1989, I have a media arts, film and photography background from MSU, but they talked about, Bill Jay was a photo historian talking about, Photoshop and creating these false narratives coming out, then who owns the rights. And now with ChatGPT and AI generating these lifelike images, lifelike, whether conversations or can create these movies of what's real and what's not. And that really starting to frazzle democracy in terms of creating a narrative that's not real. And how can we know that what we're seeing is actually real or happening? What are your thoughts on those kind of from now to the future?
I would say it would be nice if we had more congressional action on trying to restrict or try to police the use of deep fakes and other types of content in political contexts, but that's expecting a lot more of Congress than they're willing to do typically. And they're always usually a few steps behind a problem technologically.
Even with TikToks.
TikTok. Yeah.
I think that right now, I think that like David said, right, I think that they need to address it. I think when GPT-4 was out, there was a push for a moratorium on advancing AI until we could basically figure out what are some of the pitfalls, what are some of the things we could do better. One of the things I think at this point now, I think that probably would be great if, there could be a law or rule or at least some agreement amongst people, right? That if you're using AI to create something, just say it, right? But other than that, I think that we are in dire need of some of those rules, restrictions. And like I say at the beginning, right? Like freedom is really about having those boundaries.
Yeah. Creating a digital signature, so to speak, on a piece that's been created that it would present itself as something that's created and not real.
Absolutely, yeah. The metadata, just having that basic kind of context there would be nice, but that's almost too much to ask.
Yeah.
And as a follow-up to that, both with respect to AI or deep fakes, but also even just conspiracy theories. What do you think is a great policy response when we do have governments, whether it's China or Russia, utilizing this technology to mess around with our elections? I mean, that's becoming kind of a go-to strategy, I think, at least in with presidential politics. What can we do either from a policy or a technological perspective to combat foreign governments from interfering in our elections via technology?
Well, I will say that what Florida and Texas is doing is exactly what we don't need in order to try and prevent that.
Yes.
The Texas law would specifically allow for more misinformation and disinformation to reach social media platforms and make it harder to stop it. They're private companies. I mean, I'm a strong defender and believer in the First Amendment, but like, if a private company wants to use its platform in a different manner, they're not the government, and that's their prerogative. And I don't mind when it comes to trying to stop certain dangerous types of messages in that kind of context. But yeah, the US government's is not very open about its own practices of trying to stop the practice. I'm sure that there's something happening behind the scenes that we're not aware of and that they're tracking it, but they're not exactly giving us a lot as citizens to work from in terms of making educated decisions about what is and is not conspiracy information, I guess. But is that really what they think their role is either? I don't know.
With all due respect, right, and I think that maybe a different question that needs to be asked is that what do they gain from trying to interfere with the elections, right? I think the better question might be that if they want to see America, crumble and go to ruins, what would they do? And I think that one of the things that would come to mind for me is personal opinion. If I disappear after this, you might know it might be this answer. I mean, is that I think that by having Americans fight each other, right?
Yes.
Right, and I think that that's really
Yeah.
what that might be looking to do, liberals and conservatives. Let's not have common ground. Let's fight.
Absolutely.
Let's go to war. Let's have a civil war. In that situation, I think a foreign power will greatly benefit from that. right?
Absolutely. That's explicitly Putin's goal. And that's why he's doing that. He's trying to put us against one another.
From Khrushchev forward,
Yeah.
he said he would take over America without firing a shot.
Well, this has been a tremendous conversation. Thank you so much. Thanks for enjoy the rest of the panels, and thank you for coming to CSU's democracy programming. We're doing it all month long, so hope you can take advantage of more of our sessions. Thank you.